Okay, so good evening, everyone, on this gorgeous evening in Vermont. I don't know how many of you are not actually in Vermont other than Jane, but it's gorgeous here. I'm Liza Bernard from the Norman Williams Public Library in Woodstock, and we are thrilled to welcome Jane Hirshfield to our little library. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. As I said, this is being recorded, and our guests will be on the screen, and you, the audience, will remain muted in the background. And we invite you to put comments and questions in the chat box, which I will filter and share later on in the presentation. The format's straightforward. I'll do a brief introduction, and then our guests will have the stage. And before we begin, I want to thank a very special library patron, Leslie, for connecting Jane and I. She came in during Poetry Month, which is April, and saw our poetry display, and her eye caught on Ledger, which is Jane's newest collection. And she said, I know Jane, and here we are. So that's how this came about, and we're thrilled of how people connect. I was serious when I said it would be a brief introduction, and because if I don't skim over much of what Jane Hirshfield has done, there will be no time left for her to speak. Jane Hirshfield is the author of 9 collections of poetry, including The Beauty, which was longlisted for the National Book Award that came out in 2015. Come Thief, a 2011 title, which was a finalist for the PEN USA Poetry Award. And Given Sugar, Given Salt, which is a title I have always loved, which is a 2001 finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her most recent collection, as I mentioned, is Ledger, which was first published in 2020, right as the pandemic hit. So she's also published 2 books of essays, 9 Gates, Entering the Mind of Poetry, and 10 Windows, How Great Poems Transform the World. And she also, just because she's not doing anything else, has edited and co-translated 4 volumes of world poetry. Jane has been honored with numerous fellowships and awards, including from the Guggenheim, Rockefellers, the National Endowment of the Arts, and closer to home, the Donald Hall-Jane Kenyon Prize in American Poetry. Her work has appeared in many periodicals and anthologies, including the New Yorker, the Atlantic, New York Review of Books, and 10 editions of the Best American Poetry. She's a recipient of the Academy Fellowship from the Academy of American Poets, and she was elected as chancellor in 2012. 7 years later, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is a great honor. And though not a full-time academic, she has taught widely on both sides of the country, including the University of California at Stanford and the Bennington Writing Seminar and Breadloaf and in Napa Valley. She's currently based in California, though she was born in New York City, and she received her bachelor's from Princeton. And she received lay ordination in Soto Zen. I think, did I say that right? Yes. Soto Zen at the San Francisco Zen Center, and that does inform much of her writing. And we are extremely fortunate to have her with us tonight virtually. Welcome, Jane Hirshfield.
Well, thank you very much. I hope someday I'll get to come visit in person. I hear the library is absolutely beautiful, yes. And extraordinary public libraries are very close to my heart. So I'm going to start this reading with a poem not of my own, but one acknowledging what is happening across the world and that I know many people are paying close attention to. This is a poem written during the 3rd week of the war by a Ukrainian poet, Pavlo Korobchak. He and I did, Zoom is an amazing thing in that, before the pandemic, it was available, but none of us were quite so quick to leap onto it and to know that people would come. And there was a Zoom reading of American writers, including the great Marilyn Robinson, and Ukrainian writers a few weeks ago. And Pavlo's poem made a huge impression on me, so I asked him if I could have a copy. And he sent me 3 English translations, which I immediately then did a version of my own, combining and changing a few things. So here is his poem. It has no title, but honors what we know is beyond saying. I cannot speak. I do not wish to speak, because words still exist, while those killed by unspeakable Russians do not. If only words could be bartered for lives and people live again for the words given up, I'd gladly trade the most beautiful: amaranth, harbinger, serendipity, astrolabe, petrichor, touch. What good are words when there's no one to whom you can speak them? To the living return to us, I would say joyously, ah, 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 ah. So that was Pavlo Korobchuk. For turning to my own work, I will be reading to you almost entirely from Ledger, the 2020, published into the very beginning of the pandemic, came out the day that America realized that the world had changed. And if there's time, I might read you 3 new poems at the end, but I usually run out of time. I'm going to start with the preface poem to the book. It was written in 2014 as a poem of environmental foreboding. It was first published as a political poem. It was first published by the Academy of American Poets on the day of the inauguration of the former administration, and went quickly viral as a political poem. So I suppose it speaks to each of our current catastrophes. And it's a poem imagining the future, looking back on us, and hoping to make itself incomprehensible. Because if the poem succeeded in its work, it would become meaningless, because it wishes so much that it did not have to exist at all. Let them not say. Let them not say we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty. It burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. And now the second first poem in the book. Some books have 2 first poems. This is called The Bowl, and you might think of it, it is primarily any bowl, an ordinary bowl, the bowl in your kitchen. But there is a slight flavor in it of the begging bowl carried by Buddhist monks in traditional cultures when they do what in Japan is called takahatsu, which is the monks will go out to the community holding an empty bowl, and people will either feed them if they believe that the practice and usefulness of their monastic life matters, or if they put nothing in the bowl, the monks will go hungry. The bowl. If meat is put into the bowl, meat is eaten. If rice is put into the bowl, it may be cooked. If a shoe is put into the bowl, the leather is chewed and chewed over, a sentence that cannot be taken in or forgotten. A day, if a day could feel, must feel like a bowl. wars, loves, trucks, betrayals, kindness. It eats them. Then the next day comes, spotless and hungry. The bowl cannot be thrown away. It cannot be broken. It is calm, uneclipsable, rindless, and big though it seems, fits exactly in 2 human hands. Hands with 10 fingers, 54 bones, capacities strange to us, almost past measure. Scented as the curve of the bowl is, with cardamom, star anise, long pepper, cinnamon, hyssop. Ledger is titled what it is because it is a book with a great deal of counting and accounting in it. The poems in it cover a lot of different subjects, but the vertebral spine of the book is the catastrophe of the biosphere, of climate warming, of species extinction, of toxins. And there are more numbers than usual appear in this book. This is one such poem. As if hearing heavy furniture moved on the floor above us. As things grow rarer, they enter the ranges of counting. Remain this many Siberian tigers, that many African elephants, 300 red-legged egrets. We scrape from the world its tilt and meander of wonder, as if eating the last burned onions and carrots from a cast iron pan. Closing eyes to taste better the char of ordinary sweetness. This next poem covers a great deal of ground. In its title is the International Space Station going out overhead. It has the geomorphology of land formation in Florida. It alludes to the asteroid that took the dinosaurs. It also alludes to the civil war in Syria, to terrorism, and at the poem's end to a crisis that was going on when I wrote this poem some years ago and is still going on today, of refugees, and in this case, refugees in the Mediterranean. Day beginning with seeing the International Space Station and a full moon over the Gulf of Mexico and all its invisible fishes. None of this had to happen. Not Florida, not the ibis's beak, not water, not the horseshoe crab's empty body, and not the living starfish. Evolution might have turned left at the corner and gone down another street entirely. The asteroid might have missed. The seams of limestone need not have been susceptible to sand and mangroves. The radio might have found a different music. The hips of one man and the hips of another might have stood beside each other on a bus in Aleppo and recognized themselves as long-lost brothers. The key could have broken off in the lock, and the nail can refused its lid. I might have been the fish the brown pelican swallowed. You might have been the way the moon kept not setting long after we thought it would, long after the sun was catching inside the low wave curls coming in at a certain angle. The light might not have been eaten again by its moving. If the unbearable were not weightless, we might yet buckle under the grief of what hasn't changed yet. Across the world, a man pulls a woman from the water from which the leapt from overfilled boat has entirely vanished. From the water pulls one child, another. Both are living, and both will continue to live. This did not have to happen. No part of this had to happen. So, changing subject for a moment. Everything in this poem is true and actual. It was written not too far from where you are, at the artist colony MacDowell in Peterborough, New Hampshire, which has, as I was told there, they give anybody who goes to work at MacDowell a library card, and the Peterborough Public Library is the first public library founded in this country. So it's quite wonderful itself. I wanted to be surprised. To such a request, the world is obliging. In just the past week, a rotund porcupine, who seemed equally startled by me. The man who swallowed a tiny microphone to record the sounds of his body, not considering beforehand how he might remove it. A cabbage and mustard sandwich on marbled bread. How easily the large spiders were caught with a clear plastic cup surprised even them. I don't know why I was surprised every time love started or ended, or why each time a new fossil, Earth-like planet, or war, or that no one kept being there when the doorknob had clearly. What should not have been so surprising, my error after error, recognized when appearing on the faces of others. What did not surprise enough, my daily expectation that anything would continue, and then that so much did continue when so much did not. Small rivulets still flowing downhill when it wasn't raining. A sister's birthday. Also, the stubborn, courteous persistence that even today, please means please. Good morning is still understood as good morning. And that when I wake up, the window's distant mountain remains a mountain. The borrowed city around me is still a city and standing. Its alleys and markets, offices of dentists, drugstore, liquor store, Chevron. Its library that charges a happy surprise, no fine for overdue books. Borges, Baldwin, Szymborska, Morrison, Cavafy. So many of you, if you don't own one of those vests with a lot of pockets, you, I'm sure, at least have seen them, originally designed for fisher people, but I have found it endlessly useful for traveling. And it lets me not carry a purse anymore when I travel, which is great. I just flew what turned out to be the flight that took me over 1 million miles for my frequent flyer account with my local airline. And they woke me up mid-Pacific and gave me a glass of champagne. And most of those 1 million miles were astonishingly for poetry. And one of the odd things about this book is it has so many references to so many places that poetry took me. And to have been reading from it over Zoom during the pandemic when none of us was flying anywhere has been surreal. I only took my first work travel flight the beginning of this month. Anyhow, vest. I put on again the vest of many pockets. It is easy to forget which holds the reading glasses, which the small pen, which the house keys, the compass and whistle, the passport. To forget at last for weeks even the pocket holding the day of digging a place for my sister's ashes, the one holding the day where someone will soon enough put my own. To misplace the pocket of touching the walls at Auschwitz would seem impossible. It is not. To misplace for a decade the pocket of tears. I rummage and rummage, transfers for Munich, for Melbourne, to Oslo, a receipt for a Singapore copy, a device holding music, Bach, Garcia, Richter, Porter, Pärt. A woman, long dead now, gave me, when I told her I could not sing, a kazoo, now in a pocket. Somewhere a pocket holding a Steinway, somewhere a pocket holding a packet of salt. Borgesian vest, Oxford English Dictionary vest with a magnifying glass tucked inside one snap-closed pocket, Wikipedia vest, Rosetta vest, Enigma vest of decoding. How is it one person can carry your weight for a lifetime, one person slip into your open arms for a lifetime, who was given the world and hunted for tissues, for chapstick? So along with doing a number of translations, often with help from a native speaker or multiple English versions of older work, I have been more and more being translated, which is an entirely different experience. There seems to be especially difficulty between Russian and English cultural issues. I get more questions from my Russian translators than from anywhere else in the world. And with that last poem, my translator was very concerned because she said that the chapstick, which obviously in my poem is a sort of small discardable item that soothes your blistered lips. She said in Russia that was something of a luxury item. But we went back and forth. There was nothing that could substitute for the tissues and chapstick. And so in the end, she said, they'll understand that in America, it's not so expensive. So this is an experience I imagine many of you have had with your own computer files, some variation of. Advice to myself. The computer file of which I have no recollection is labeled Advice to Myself. I click it open, look, scroll further down. The screen stays backlit and empty. Thus I meet myself again, hopeful and useless, a mystery, precisely as I must have done on August 19th, 2010, 11:08 a.m. Words. Words are loyal. Whatever they name, they take the side of. As the word courage will afterward grip just as well the frightened girl soldier who stands on one side of barbed wire, the frightened boy soldier who stands on the other. Death's clay. They look at each other with wide open eyes, and words that love peace, love gossip, refuse to condemn them. A ream of paper. I have a ream of paper, a cartridge of ink, almonds, coffee, a wool scarf for warmth. Whatever handcuffs the soul, I have brought here. Whatever distances the heart, I have brought here. A deer rises onto her haunches to reach for an apple, though many fallen apples are on the ground. Like others. In the end, I was like others, a person, sometimes embarrassed, sometimes afraid. When fire was shouted, some ran toward it, some away. I neck deep among them. I write a number of very short poems, and I'll just read you 3 of them from this book. I call them pebbles and run them as a series because to do otherwise would be rude to the trees to have so few words on each page, but they're all quite independent poems. And since I am reading for a library, I thought I would give you another poem that mentions libraries. Library book with many precisely turned down corners. I unfold carefully the thoughts of one who has come before me, the way a listening dog's ears may be seen lifting to some sound beyond its person's quite understanding. That was the Szymborska book of poems that I alluded to in the earlier poem. 6th extinction. It took with it the words that could have described it. Obstacle. This body still walking. The wind must go around it. And it was one of those, I'm sure you've noticed this, if you're walking with the wind directly behind it, you're walking into your own lee. So there is a calm directly in front of you, the space, no matter how hard the wind is blowing. I'm going to read you now a series of poems. I'm sorry, this is a kind of, I've gone over my lifetime from maybe 1 chuckle per book up to 7. And I'm not giving you the 6 other chuckles. You might have smiled once over the course of this, but it's a book looking at a lot of difficult things. Maybe we'll see. But this series of poems were written during the 3 years of the illness and death of the person who was my first great love from glioblastoma, the brain cancer. And 3 years was a long time to survive that. And he and his wife did everything possible, all the Western medicine and some alternative things. And during that time, I was pondering his illness and all of our mortality. There's a phrase at the beginning of each of these poems, which I borrowed from the Roman Emperor Hadrian. We have only 1 poem by Hadrian. It was written on his own deathbed, in which he is talking to his own life as it departs, and he addresses it as little soul. And I could find nothing so tender as that. And so I used it for these poems. The first one has a title in Latin, a phrase I'm sure familiar to everyone, amor fati, the love of fate, the embrace of your own life, whatever it is, it brings you. Little soul, you have wandered lost a long time. The woods all dark now, birded and eyed. Then a light, a cabin, a fire, a door standing open. The fairy tales warn you, do not go in. You who would eat will be eaten. You go in, you quicken. You want to have feet. You want to have eyes. You want to have fears. Snow. Little soul, for you too, death is coming. Was there something you thought you needed to do? Snow does not walk into a room and wonder why. Kitchen. Little soul, how useful was hunger. From whatever it was we fell into, you and I, it sprang open our fingers' grip. Yet a life is not prepared for its ending like a sliced eggplant, salted and pressed to let leave from itself what is bitter. Harness. Little soul, you and I will become the memory of a memory of a memory. A horse released of the traces forgets the weight of the wagon. Rust flakes on wind. Little soul, a day comes when retrospection ceases. A person falling does not mid-plummet look up. Still, for a few seconds on Wednesday, where are my truck keys? On Thursday, on Sunday, where are my truck keys? Pelt. Little soul, the book of your hours is closing over its golds, its reds, your grazing dog, your rivers, ladders, ribcage. A life turns into its patterns and perfumes, then into its pelt. I don't know now if we were one, if we were two, a stippling. Whither thou goest, we'd said. Wood, salt, tin. Little soul, do you remember? You once walked over wooden boards to a house that sat on stilts in the sea. It was early. The sun painted brightness onto the water, and wherever you sat, that path led directly to you. Some mornings the sea road was muted, scratched tin. Some mornings blinding. Then it would leave. Little soul, it is strange. Even now, it is early. And the final poem. I said, I believed a world without you unimaginable, now cutting its flowers to go with you into the fire. So I have a few minutes left before we will go to questions, answers, conversation. Let's see. I will give you another of the environmental poems. No wind, no rain. No wind, no rain. The tree just fell, as a piece of fruit does. But no, not fruit, not ripe, not fell. It broke, it shattered. One cone's addition of resinous cell sap, one small-bodied bird arriving to tap for a beetle. It shattered. What word, what act was it we thought did not matter? So that refers to the butterfly effect that people began to understand a few decades ago. on the fifth day, this was January 24th, 2017, the day that the White House took down from its website every mention of climate change and ordered all of the scientists working for the federal government not to speak of their research without having their results vetted first. This struck me as severely as would have been censoring the poets. I have a great many of my closest friends are research scientists. I wrote this poem by the afternoon of that day and sent it to 3 of my friends. By 2 days later, I was getting thank you notes from all over the country. A few months later, I read it at the first March for Science in Washington, D.C., to something like 40 or 50,000 people on the mall at the rally before the march. On the fifth day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air, and the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. Bound to gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke the fifth day of silence. So I will give you, to close, I think, one new poem. Much to my surprise, my editor at Knopf talked me into doing a new and selected poems that will come out late next year. So I have been beginning to work on both the selecting of what will go in from the earlier books and also the order of the new ones. So because I read you know, certain images stay with a writer. You know, you use a word and the word just wants to be used again. There's something attractive about it. So you heard in the poems, in the Little Soul poems, a reference to tin. Here is a poem titled Tin. I studied much and remembered little, but the world is generous. It kept offering figs and cheeses. Never mind that soon I'll have to give it all back. The world, the figs. To be a train station of existence is no small matter. It doesn't need to be Grand Central or Hyder Pasha Station. The engine shed could be low, windowed with coal dust under a slat-shingled roof. It could be tin. Another mystery bandaged with rivets and rubies, leaking cold and heat in both directions, as the earth does. So thank you very much. And now we will talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Wow. It must be interesting to be sharing these incredible words and poems without any sort of feedback from the listener. I know that I was offering feedback, but you couldn't see it. So thank you so much. This has been amazing. I invite everyone, if they have questions, to put them in the chat, and I will try and share them as we go along. I actually have a question, and that has to do, first of all, appreciating your attention to language. I love wordplay and how language is so powerful. And you, as you say, you use words in a way that can be, they do go through the poems. I have a question about the essays and assays versus the poetic structure. In the book in Ledger, there's a piece called Capital and Assay, ASSAY. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so that's a real outlier because it's long and it's a prose poem. And so the essay form was something I stumbled into quite a few books ago. And it began with just one poem, a poem oddly that arrived and wanted to be written, having to do with Edgar Allan Poe, who I had already written about a couple of years before in an essay about hidden things. And there's a section looking at Poe and his stories and things that are hidden out in the open, like the purloined letter. And then he revisited me, he came back in a poem, but the poem had a funny music to it. It had an unusual music to it in that it was not itself a prose poem, but it thought more logically, more the way prose does. And after I'd written it, I was very happy with it, but I thought readers might need a little help getting on board this change of tone. And so I thought, well, how can I help them? Because you want to help your readers hear things the way you hear them in your own ear when you're writing them. I wanted people to understand that this voice was a little different. And so the phrase "an assay" as a subtitle came to me thinking it is a cognate word of essay. So essayer in French, to try, goes to both the prose essay and to these essays, but also behind it, equally behind it, was the assaying machines of research science, where you take a substance, you put it into these machines, they whirl the substance around until it separates into its component parts, and then you know what you have. It's also the same word as the assayer's office that you would take your gold to during the gold rush. Every town would have an assaying office, and your rock is so much gold. And so I realized as I, went on to write other poems using the same tone of thinking and feeling, that to subtitle them essays just began to make sense, because whatever they're looking at, they are taking apart, breaking into its components, examining, but in the way of poetry rather in the way of research science. And so this outlier poem in the book, which is far too long for me to read, people, I'm sorry, you'll have to take it out of the library if you're curious, was actually written, somebody did an anthology of poems about capital, about money and wealth and accumulation. And they asked everybody who wrote a poem that was in the book to also write a prose accompaniment introduction to the poem. And this was actually not the poem, which was already published in an earlier book, but this was the introduction to it. And I just decided to put it in this book as an outlier piece of thinking that also has to do with the environment, how we use it, what becomes of it. And it begins talking about the river that goes with the King Midas story. And capital does, it brings us many things, but if you get overly engaged with it, it turns your world to something without heart and without life and fate and vulnerability and susceptibility, as the King Midas story has it. So there's your answer to that.
Are you going to read any of it, or is it too long? Okay.
It's too long. I've never actually said that poem out loud. So if you have some lines from it you'd like to read, please go ahead.
No, I don't think that I could read nearly as well as you do. And that's actually one of the things that people have mentioned, is that they'll now be able to read your poems in your voice. And that makes such a big difference to, as you say, presenting a poem so that it can be absorbed the way it was presented. So we do have some questions about the first of all, there's a lot of appreciations in the chat, without
Thank
questions.
you. I don't look at the chat. I'm sorry, but I can't talk
Distracting.
at the
Yeah,
same
that's
time.
my job. But there is a question, and it's about the craft. And the question is, does the poem, do poems spill out complete, or do you edit it to fullness after the draft?
So I write in a number of different ways, and some of them arrive, either identical or very close to the finished piece that you will find on the page. And others are hard won and slow and revised 87 times. And I'm not at all sure that anybody but me would know which is which. One of the shocking things for a young poet to discover is you think if a poem comes through you and emerges whole in a great rush, a gift of the muse, you think that means it's a good poem, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And that's a real shock, because that even a gift of the muse can be flawed or unfinished or have taken a strange turn. So I always ask all of my poems, a lot of, would you like to change in some way? You're everything from the shape of it on the page, the line breaks, to changing the to a, or vice versa, makes a huge difference. These tiny words are enormously large signals of relationship. The is something specific and known. A is something, general and more floating. Singular and plural. Verb tenses. One of the things I've been doing as I put together the new section of this new and selected poems, I noticed how many of the poems were in the verb tense of the past tense, which you heard with "let them not say," the future looking back. There's a name for this in rhetoric. It's called prolepsis. And because I'm older, because my life has become offered more possibilities for retrospective thinking, more poems are coming in this past tense, which I find very powerful. It's the verb tense of Emily Dickinson's "I heard a fly buzz when I died." But I thought too many of them were past tense. I'm not dead yet. I probably, given my family history, I've got, good 20 years to go, maybe 30. And so I've been moving some of those verb tenses from past tense to present tense, as not only for the sake of the poems and the variety and the reader's experience, but also because of something that I cannot say better than Yeats said in a little untitled quatrain that appears as a section break in one of his collected poems that he did when he was alive. So I'm going to give you his quatrain. My friends who say I do it wrong whenever I revise my song do not know what is at stake. It is myself that I remake. And I think that is what we do when we revise our poems. We are not only revising the poem, we are revising our lives, ourselves, who we are. You are changing not only what you have said, but what you will say next when you take a poem and work with it. So poems are rather, to use an old word, which is a new age word, I suppose, it's a rather yogic activity, in that it says, if you just take a different stance and take a different position in this moment, you will change self, and you will change world, and you will change future. And I'm deeply engaged with this hope of changing the future towards one kinder, more viable, more recognizing interconnection. That is part of the work that feels given to me to do at this point in my life.
You can see that in a lot of the poems, is that the topics that you approach from such a personal place. One person asked what age you were at when you first started expressing yourself through poetry.
Oh, very young, as soon as I was taught to write. And because I don't have a mind that's good at, I love stories, I love fiction, I love narrative, but I'm not good at making it up. And so from the beginning, it was always poetry. And, you know, I spent my childhood writing poems secretly late at night and hiding them under the mattress, which, you know, I imagined, I suppose my mother wasn't seeing when she made the bed, but she probably was. So it has just always been the water I have drunk and the water I have swum in, and the life raft that helped me navigate. You know, life's hard. Children are born wailing. Life is just difficult. And poems are a way to take the difficult, to take the puzzling, the bewildering, the baffling, even the overwhelmingly joyous, and agree to navigate those waters and say yes to them and to find them desirable, to not turn your back on your own life. That is one of the tasks of a poet.
Well put. Somebody else asked who some of the newer poets that inspire you might be.
I'm very bad at answering that question, because whenever I do, I think afterwards, but I forgot to say, and there's so many.
Yeah.
So this is really just this moment's random few names. Kaveh Akbar, not such a new poet as Kaveh in terms of, you know, number of age, but a poet who has published very rarely and is suddenly quite central because of his background. Ilya Kaminsky, born in Odessa, whose first book, Dancing in Odessa, and now he is a great liaison between Ukrainian poetry and American readers. Natalie Diaz, post-colonial love poem. Again, not so much younger than me, just one generation rather than two or three poetry generations younger than me. I love Megan O'Rourke's work, and she also has her most recent book is a prose book about the experience of chronic illness that the medical system didn't know well how to deal with, and coming out in the age where so many people now are experiencing long COVID. It's a tremendously useful book to have. Camille Dungy. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop now because otherwise I'll just be scanning my shelf. I've left out, you know, I'll walk back in my room and say, oh, what is, gosh. I'm sorry. There's this marvelous book that I just read. Miko, I'm sorry, I've lost his name. I've had a terrible memory since childhood. This isn't age. This is just Jane. I have never had a good memory. All right, on to the next question.
That'll give new people to be discovered.
Yeah, it might be Miko Harvey. Try typing that in and see if a brand new book shows up. If it is, it's really sui generis, interesting book. Okay.
And then a question about when you're reading these very personal poems in public. You mentioned your family and you mentioned very close friends. Is that hard to do, or is that something that is just part of what the poems are for you?
Well, it's part of what they are for me. And even though, you know, so my sister, who was mentioned in a couple of the poems, you know, she's been dead since 2004. So I'm not exposing her privacy. when I think about, people ask me sometimes this question about, revealing poems. And I am not primarily a writer of the nude self-portrait. I am a writer of the X-ray. And so you see a few of the facts of my life, but not that many. I never did my first love who died, that series. I did not know, since I was writing the poems before he died, and other poems about him are also in this book. I really didn't know if I should show them to him or not, because they were about his dying. And in the end, I didn't. In the end, he never saw them, and that felt right to me. But he would not at all mind my giving them to other people, because this experience of losing everyone we love until they lose us, this is universal. This is such a shared taproot experience, and I don't think he would mind at all.
So it was such an honoring of him. So, well, we've got just a couple more minutes. Do you have another short poem to share? Do you have anything else that we haven't touched on that you wanted to mention to?
Well, we can close with a poem. It's always nice to close with a poem. Sorry about the glare. There's a skylight, and the sun has come into the skylight and done terrible things to my Zoom lighting. Let me see, if I lean forward, I'm out of it. I'll get louder because I'm closer to the microphone. I will give you the final poem in the book. It is a poem of apology for writing such a sad book about such a beautiful world. My debt. Like all who believe in the senses, I was an accountant, copyist, statistician, not registrar, witness, permitted to touch the leaf of a thistle, the trembling work of a spider, to ponder the Hubble's recordings. It did not matter if I believed in the party of particle or wave, as I carried no weapon. It did not matter if I believed. I weighed ashes, actions, cities that glittered like rubies on the scales I was given, calibrated in units of fear and amazement. I wrote the word it, the word is. I entered the debt that is owed to the real. Forgive, spine-covered leaf, soft-bodied spider, octopus lifting one curious tentacle back toward the hand of the diver, that in such black ink I set down your flammable colors. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining us here. This has been just an amazing treat. And we do hope that you'll come to Woodstock when you're on the East Coast sometime.
Thank you. I would love that.
And we'll get the video up and people can share it far and wide. It'll probably take about a week to get up on the website. But thank you very much for reading to us. And thank you everybody for joining us on this gorgeous Vermont evening. So without further ado,
good night.
enjoy the summer.